for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Thanks for allowing me to be here. If I understood my task correctly this morning, it's to talk about innovation and policy. Does innovation inform policy, or does policy inform innovation? The answer, of course, is it's both, but we might look to just a couple of examples as to why it is perhaps more satisfactory when innovation drives the policy rather than the other way around. But, you know, as we sit here, there's really not much happening right now in Washington, right? And there's not much happening in healthcare. It's kind of a sleepy little backwater of a policy subcommittee that I'm going to chair this term. It's a phenomenal opportunity, and it is a phenomenal opportunity to get things right and to provide for people in a way that has never been provided in the past, or it is also an opportunity where things could get much more dangerous in the days and weeks and months ahead. So that's kind of the challenge that's certainly before me as a member of the subcommittee, as an individual member of Congress, as someone who represents 790,000 people back in North Texas. My life has been in medicine before I came to Congress, and so when I think of things that were like game changers in healthcare, I typically think of things, discoveries and devices, drugs that have been developed and how they have changed medicine. But as you know, we take a step back this morning and just think about over the last 20 years, there were two things that my opinion, profoundly change providing health care for people that actually didn't have a lot to do with things in the laboratory bench. 20 years ago, last August, the Kennedy-Kassebaum bill passed. And although there were a lot of things in the bill, one of the little demonstration projects tucked into that bill was the ability to provide health savings accounts. And in fact, they were capped at 750,000 of those that would be allowed in the term of the bill. I wanted one. I was afraid I wouldn't get my stuff in time to get one of those 750,000 health savings accounts. It turned out I needn't have worried. There were plenty to go around for anyone who wanted them. They were not all that flexible back in those days. There were only one or two insurers in my area that would even talk to you about that phenomenon of a health savings account. But when you stop and think about all the medicine is, there can be an unlimited demand. I know this. I used to practice medicine. And the barriers that should be placed by the government? Should it be a waiting list? Should it be rationing? Or do you want some sensitivity, some market feedback on the part of, yes, the physician, but the patient primarily, because the patient is the one who I believe should be in control of that situation. And the health savings account is the perfect model to allow that to happen. Last night in the Rules Committee, we were marking up the budget that's going to allow the reconciliation, that's going to allow repeal or repeal plus, whatever comes down the pipe from the committees. And in that, a question was posed by a Democratic member from Florida. I challenge any one of you on this Rules Committee to point to me a year where your health insurance premium went down. And I said, I'll be happy to. It's the day I got a health savings account. My health premium dramatically reduced. And if I had the discipline to put some of that money I'm not spending on a premium into a tax-deferred savings account, and again, that was 20 years ago, over that time span, there's the ability for me to garner a significant nest egg against medical expenditures. I would argue that whatever we do next, I would like to see expansion of health savings accounts as a, not for everyone, but as a fundamental part of policy. I would like to see that happen. Now, one of the things that we're hearing a lot right now, and another issue that came up yesterday, last night, late in the Rules Committee markup, was another Democratic member from Massachusetts said 20 million, 30 million, whatever the figure of the day is, are losing their health insurance. You know, I don't recall that individual being terribly concerned when I was one of the 6 million people that lost my health insurance at the end of calendar year 2013. I had a health savings account. I had a high deductible policy. The president told me it was a junk policy and I had to get rid of it, that he knew better. This is what I was going to have to buy. There were 10 essential health benefits that had to be covered and may not have been covered in the high deductible policy that I had. But where was the concern for people who were losing those policies when the Affordable Care Act implementation happened January 1st of 2014? I will tell you, as the Affordable Care Act was implemented, there was a special deal for members of Congress. I thought that was wrong. The special deal for members of Congress was that we could take a subsidy and walk it into an exchange as long as we were willing to purchase in the DC shop exchange. Number one, my doctors are not in DC, they're back in Texas, so that was of no real value to me. But the other thing was, I knew my constituents at town halls back in Texas would not understand why I, as a member of Congress, got a special subsidy that was untaxed that I could walk into an exchange. So I said, I can't do it. No, thank you. And I went to healthcare.gov and signed up, just like so many other people tried to do that October, November, December. It was one of the most miserable experiences I've ever had in my life. I was worried that I was actually going to be able to get signed up by the time the deadline expired at midnight on December 31st. And then remember, they extended it for a few days. But it was a tense time for people buying in the individual market. It was the appropriate thing to do because my constituents that I represent who are in the individual market were going through the same thing. And of course, I've heard from a lot of them over the course of time with the Affordable Care Act. Now, 2 or 3 days ago, the president gave a beautiful address in Chicago and talked about how great things were with health care. And you almost feel like you're in a Dickens novel. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. Look, people are struggling right now under the constraints of the Affordable Care Act. And I view myself as on a rescue mission here to try to help people who have in fact been hurt by the federal policies that have been imposed. But again, the other thing that happened over the last, in fact, 10 years ago last week, I think it was the introduction of the iPhone. Now, you don't think that is a startling medical discovery, but my iPhone can take my EKG, can't yours? And in fact, this morning, just to make sure, because I read a lot of Twitter reports on the Rules Committee last night, this guy has no heart, so I thought I'd better assess whether there in fact was electrical activity in the myocardium. I mean, I'm happy to report there was. And in fact, on my watch that talks to my phone, there's a little icon that I can actually click on that icon to get the EKG function of the phone, except when I do that, it says, this function is not available in your country. So maybe that's something we ought to work on from a regulatory standpoint. But think how life has changed for people in the last 10 years because of the handheld devices, the smartphones that we all carry with us. And mine will take my blood pressure, will take my assessed blood sugar, it'll check my weight, and I'm worried that the NSA has hacked into that and altered it on me. But I practiced obstetrics. Back in the days that I practiced obstetrics, it never failed. 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, a patient would come in her last 2 or 3 weeks of pregnancy with a blood pressure that was just enough elevated over what it had been before to cause some concern. Now here's the problem. Most people who have that it will turn out to not be a problem. It may have just been because I didn't have enough parking places close to the office and she was mad at me when the time the blood pressure was measured. But bad things can happen in that situation also. So if you go the ultra careful route and say, look, you have a blood pressure measurement that is higher than it's ever been before, I need to put you in the hospital for a couple of days and monitor this and make sure something bad is going to happen. And indeed, we did that a lot. Domiciliary care late in pregnancy in order to assess or make sure that preeclampsia was not going to lead to eclampsia and all kinds of bad things down the road. If you guessed wrong and said, well, you know, your blood pressure's a little up, let me see first thing Monday morning and let's get this checked again and make sure that it's not going to be a problem. And then at 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, if she's in the emergency room with a platelet count that's way low, a baby that's in distress, all kinds of bad things happening, you guessed wrong. How great is it in this day and age that someone can have a blood pressure cuff that can actually measure their blood pressure, record it on their iPhone, email it to their doctor, and that monitoring can occur in an out-of-hospital event, as an out-of-hospital event, and people can go on about their business, and you significantly reduce unnecessary hospitalizations. But more important to me as an obstetrician who practiced defensive medicine, you also can significantly reduce the very unfortunate sequelae if you in fact assess incorrectly at the time of that event. So those two things, the development of a health savings account to put the patient back in charge, the iPhone or the smartphone or the handheld device that gives the patient actually the ability to participate in the monitoring of their care. These are two things that I think will profoundly change and affect the future of care. Certainly it would, if I were still in practice, I would be incorporating those activities on an ongoing basis. Now, as I mentioned, my smartwatch won't communicate with my smartphone about the EKG because it's not available in my country. One of the other tasks we have, oh, by the way, if reforming or replacing the Affordable Care Act was not enough work for the subcommittee that I'm chairing now this term in Congress, we also have the user fee agreements at the Food and Drug Administration that are expiring. And I know many people at the American Enterprise Institute are interested in what happens at the FDA because I've heard from some of you. I'm interested as well. We just went through a big legislative effort with Cures for the 21st Century. There will be ongoing work that's done at the regulatory side with the Food and Drug Administration in the user fee reauthorizations. This happened in 2012. That was an election year. It was a tough year to get any kind of bipartisan agreement, but we did, and the bill got signed into law 3 months early. You don't know that because the president signed it in a broom closet. It was 2012. He was running for re-election. He didn't want to be seen with us. We didn't want to be seen with him. So it just happened. It just got done. The work got done for the American people. And again, I would point out that it was 3 months ahead of schedule. Same thing will happen this year. All the time that the Affordable Care Act, whatever happens next in that, is being marked up and debated in the Subcommittee of Health and Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means. There will also be activity happening on the Food and Drug Administration reauthorization. And that's critical work because the ACA reform is something that's going to happen right now. The FDA reform are things that happen for years into the future. And I know that because of when we did our last one, it was very rare that a week went by that there was not someone in my office with a tale of woe about how they'd had difficulty dealing with getting things through the FDA. And we need to make that a more straightforward. I'm not saying that anything needs to be shortened or curtailed, but we need to make it more straightforward. And the agency cannot change the rules late in the game, send everyone back to the starting gate and say, we've decided on a different set of parameters that have to be shown for this, and you just simply have to start all over again. Let me just, in the next couple of minutes, talk to you more from my role as a member of Congress, my role as being on the subcommittee that's going to be doing a lot of this work on the Affordable Care Act. 3 big pieces of health policy have happened in my brief tenure in Congress, which started in January of 2003. 2003, you may recall, was the year of the Medicare Modernization Act. Bill Thomas, chairman of the Ways and Means, actually worked very closely with counterparts over in the Senate. Remember, Senator Ted Kennedy was involved with that, and ultimately came up with the what is now known as Part D, the prescription drug benefit in Medicare. President Bush, when he was running, said, I am going to get this done. So there was no question about whether or not it would be done, and in fact, it got done. Arguably bipartisan, although certainly there are people on the Democratic side of the subcommittee who will say, no, there really wasn't bipartisan. You held the vote open for 4.5 or 5 hours. That's how it was bipartisan. And that may be true, but we were just waiting for David Wu to vote. And when he did, it was all over pretty quickly. But as that implementation occurred with Part D, there were some tough spots. January 2006, when the date that it all began, phones were ringing because people were having problems. I would argue because it was bipartisan, because both President Bush and Senator Kennedy were interested in this thing working right, and of course you had Secretary Mike Leavitt at the Department of Health and Human Services was interested in it working correctly. There was a lot of effort put into fixing those problems, and I was impressed that the problems that started at the 1st of January were quickly ameliorated such that by the end of that month, or certainly by Valentine's Day, they were pretty much old news or ancient history. The Affordable Care Act passed in 2009 and 2010. The Affordable Care Act was a singular party that was in charge of that. So when trouble occurs, Do I want to step up and help? No, my fingerprints aren't on that. Why would I get involved at this point? So the lack of bipartisanship, if you will, I think was damaging on the when the Affordable Care Act got into trouble with the implementation. It was not just distracting, it was damaging for the future of the law. And then in April of 2015, we passed a bill called the Medicare Access and Chip Reauthorization Act. I like to call it the SGR repeal because it solved a problem, albeit a problem created by Congress. It solved a problem that had bedeviled doctors, patients, and policymakers for 17 years. It took us 13 years to solve it, but indeed we did. That vote was strongly bipartisan, strongly bicameral. 392 positive aye votes on the House, 92 yes votes in the Senate. Well, when the proposed rule came out in June of this year, it scared everyone to death. Oh my gosh, what are you doing to small practices? Are people actually going to be able to continue in a 1 or 2 person practice because of some of the things that have come out in the CMS rule interpretation? And a valid question. Because of the bipartisan nature of that bill when it passed, the administrator at Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services heard from Republicans, Democrats, House members, senators, and it changed. Between June and October, that rule, when it was republished in October, was vastly different, and a lot of flexibility was built into that process. And I'll even go one step further. Andrew Slavitt said he's going to leave the comment period open on comments coming in on the macro rule that was published in October. That is exactly the type of interaction that you want. We've had 3 oversight hearings in Energy and Commerce on the implementation of macro. Even with all the other stuff that is going to be happening this year and next, we will continue to have oversight hearings on the implementation because it is so important that it be done right. Obviously, there's going to be some changes at the agency, which may affect, for better or for worse, how things happen on the implementation side. But regardless of who's the head of that agency, I want them to know that the subcommittee still feels very strongly that the legislative language that was passed is what we want to see enacted, and we don't want someone going off in a different direction from what congressional intent was when that vote received that strong bipartisan majority. So the lesson going forward, and the point I tried to make to younger members of Congress who were at the Rules Committee last night, coming both as witnesses and on the committee, the lesson going forward for us is we have a job to do for the American people. And it's not a Republican or a Democrat. It needs to be done by both sides and both houses working together. Yes, we need to listen to what the White House has to say because ultimately the president will either sign or not sign the product that we deliver to them. But it does require all hands to be on deck. It's difficult because right now the landscape is difficult. The well has been poisoned by so many people in so many different flavors. It's hard to know who went first and who drank first, but we've got to get over that. We just literally do. People are counting on us to get this done and to get this right. My focus goes to the patient, but sure, I hear from hospital executives. I promise you I hear from doctors. I hear from people in industry who are making investments right now in either medicines, devices, technologies that they think are going to be important for the future. I want them to do that. That's what the Cures for the 21st Century is all about. We want to facilitate that activity. So Dr. Antos has joined me on stage, which I know is my cue. I would just stress for people, there is the Speaker's Better Way agenda that actually was unveiled here at AEI last year, and the Better Way is the roadmap, those are the building blocks for the policy that the subcommittee is going to take up. I do want to point out, and I will leave this book for Dr. Antos. This is a book I wrote right after the Affordable Care Act passed. It was sort of like, from a doctor's perspective, what did it look like as this policy came through? And I just point out, before there was a better way, there was a doctor in the house. Many of the things that are talked about in Chapter 12 are, in fact, those policies that you see as part of the Better Way. Dr. Antos, I give you this for your historical reference.
Thank you very much. I think if you would just stay there. Okay, well, Dr. Burgess has graciously agreed to answer a few questions. And so while you're getting yourself organized, let me just suggest that you identify yourself and and make your statement in the form of a question. That means raise your voice at the end of whatever statement you're going to make. So we have a question out there, right here, Ovik.
Dr. Burgess, you.
Oh, well, yeah, wait for the microphone.
Dr. Burgess, you mentioned the importance of the latest health reform effort being bipartisan. To what degree? What's the process for engaging your friends on the Democratic side, both in the House and the Senate, to achieve some sort of bipartisan reform? And what do you think? What do you think a bipartisan replacement of the ACA looks like?
Well, it starts with listening to people who have good ideas, and I would use the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Improvement Act of 2012 as an example. Certainly when we got really deep into repealing the sustainable growth rate formula, it was that same template. Allow people to be in the room. There was, quite honestly, when we said we were going to repeal the SGR, of course everybody wants to repeal the SGR, but it hadn't been done. Folks on the Democratic side were suspicious of us. What are you going to try to pull on us here at the last minute? They suggested that perhaps we get together and just do a white paper. We suggested that no, enough energy had already gone into this that we needed to write legislative language, and the lead counsel would be in the room with us as we were having these discussions. We also opened up an email source so that people from outside, doctors and patient groups, could provide their input. We, of course, the hearings that went on tried to be not slanted toward one particular philosophy or the other. We sometimes can't help ourselves on that, as you know, but it did try to be an inclusive process. Now, is that still possible in the environment today at the level of national healthcare policy? I don't know. And in fact, one of the things I would point out is I feel very strongly on the issue of Medicaid, that block grants or per capita allotments, really something, it's an idea whose time has come. I spent the better part of December talking to my counterparts in the State House and the State Senate, saying you guys have griped about Washington being too onerous and too much in your business, and you've wanted block grants. Be sure that you're ready, because you may in fact get that, you may get that back. And I would like to see that happen. I generally don't favor things that require a larger government to administer, because as you know, we've got a government that is so big that it sometimes seems absolutely insensitive to the needs of average Americans. So I do look at it through the lens of what will pare down the size of government without being terribly disruptive, unless we need to be terribly disruptive. But I also recognize people have differing philosophies from that. And part of it, from my task as a chairman of that subcommittee, is to be open and receptive to those ideas. We'll have our fights, we'll have our all-night markups, we'll have our week-long markups, but that's appropriate. That's what we need to do.
Okay, sir. Wait for the microphone. Here we go. Great.
Hi, Bill Sigmund with the Carmen Group. One of the things that's in your jurisdiction is obviously Medicaid, and you talked about block granting. I think you've seen some letters from some governors that there's concern about Medicaid expansion and keeping that going. Mr. Cassidy, Senator Cassidy, and nominee for HHS, Mr. Price, Dr. Price, have talked about having an option where states could opt to keep expansion, Medicaid expansion under the ACA if they wanted to do that. Is that something you would consider?
Yes.
Is it something you're inclined to do?
Look, my state did not expand Medicaid. I received a letter from my governor just yesterday. The Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy had sent letters to the governors, give us your ideas, which I think is a good thing. And Governor Abbott copied me on his letter saying that the block grant approach is something that they would like to see. Now, I guess part of your question, at least in my mind, is what is the pool of money that will form the block grant, and does it need to be more equal between states? And that means a state that has expanded obviously is drawing down more federal Medicaid dollars than a state that didn't expand, that's just using its legacy or historic FMAP amount. I don't know the answer to that question. I rather expect we'll have a lot of input from a lot of folks on this. I didn't mention it, but before the end of this fiscal year, we have the not the reauthorization, but the funding for the state children's health insurance plan in our laps. Is this something that we can incorporate into whatever happens next? Or is it something that will have to be done individually, and then we'll talk about whether we go the per capita cap, the block grant, or some other more flexible model? And I don't know the answer to that. The reason my answer to your question was yes, there's obviously a willingness to listen to those ideas. 7 o'clock on Wednesday mornings for the past several years, I have positioned myself at a corner table in the Capitol Hill Club over on the Republican side to listen to any Republican doctor who wanted to come in and gripe at me about anything. And the reason I did that was because Senator Cassidy, when he was a House member, was always coming up to me with, here's 14 great ideas I have about things we ought to do. So I said, Bill, I will give you 1 hour of every week. And that's what Dr. Price eventually joined us as well at that group. So I know Dr. Cassidy has a lot of ideas, and I know he has a lot of very good ideas. And sure, there's a willingness to listen.
Great. There's someone back there.
Dr. Burgess, Paul Heldman from Heldman Simpson Partners. A follow-up to the previous question is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a better way keeps the Medicaid expansion but phases down the federal match. And my first question to you is, do you at least anticipate the federal match to those states that expanded being reduced based on the House proposal? And then you talked about really wanting to pair the government's role in healthcare and other areas. As you know, the president-elect the other day said, he opened his press conference saying that he wanted the government to be involved in some bidding process on drug prices. And I'm wondering what that means to you and how you would address the issue that he raised.
Well, let's see, the two-part question. Tell me the first part again.
First part's on the Medicaid expansion. In a better way, you talked about
yeah.
reducing the federal.
I don't know the answer to your question. I expect the answer to your question is yes, followed by an if. But I think the larger place where that discussion is going to be front and center. I mean, we're bumping up against a statutory debt limit at some point in the near future, when the new head of the Office of Management of the Budget, former Representative Mick Mulvaney, comes to us and says that we are out of borrowing authority. I think at that point in this administration, with that OMB director, it is very likely going to be we're going to be looking at places for savings, and that 100% FMAP or 90% FMAP that was part of the Medicaid expansion may very well be one of those things that's on the table. I don't know that for a fact, but I've long suspected that is where that anxiety is going to play out. On the issue of drug pricing, look, I understand there is a significant difference between Daraprim and Sovaldi. Daraprim, an antibiotic that's been around since the earth cooled the first time, should be dirt cheap. It was dirt cheap until somehow, and I believe the federal regulatory agencies participated in this, somehow we created a supply chain problem that someone decided to manipulate. On the other side, you've got Sovaldi. Sovaldi is not just a treatment for the management of hepatitis C, it's a cure for hepatitis C. And just for a little perspective, when I was a resident at Parkland Hospital in the 1970s, we knew we had hepatitis A, we knew we had hepatitis B, but there's this other hepatitis that kind of not hepatitis A or hepatitis B, and someone figured out, well, we need to call this non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then someone else said, well, why don't we just call it hepatitis C? Okay, so here's a new disease that went through the Bureau of Nomenclature, wherever that is, and now it's the baby boomer disease, right? You see it advertised, they see the advertisements on TV. But Sovaldi is a cure for that. So within my professional lifetime, we went from something we didn't even know existed, and then came to our consciousness, it was in existence, it was named, and then there was no treatment for 30 years, and now there's a cure, and it's expensive. But a liver transplant is expensive and death is permanent. So, yeah, I'll pay the money for the cure, whatever it takes. But I want the cure to be there. I don't want to do anything that is going to stop the next cure from occurring. So I know when we make policy, Daraprim, that's a real problem. And it may be partly our problem on the supply chain side. And we need to look at the things that we've done, we as federal regulators and legislators have done that allow for something like that to exist. And I will tell you, I don't think there's any secret that the cost of generic medications over the last 3 or 4 years has significantly increased. I'm not exactly sure why, that I know all of the reasons why. But I'll also say that the president-elect provided a sort of a different perspective on that. And I'm sure you have all read The Art of the Deal. I know I dusted mine off and reread it during the summer. The chapter in there where he talks about the skating rink in New York and how this was a 6 or 8 year problem, millions of dollars into it, but never is fixed. He can see it from his apartment building, and it bothers him that this public skating rink is not functional. And he and the government get into, the mayor get into a hair pulling contest in the papers about it. And eventually, okay, you're so smart, you fix it. And he did in a very short period of time. And one of the statements that was made by the mayor after it was all over is, he has the ability that the rest of us don't have. He gets the best people to work on it, and they know if they screw up, they'll never work for Donald Trump again. Well, maybe that's a philosophic approach that may be overdue in our large and overburdened federal government. So the fact that he brings a fresh perspective, I'd say I appreciate that. I don't want us to harm innovation. Federal price controls, I know, don't work in a variety of other places that they've been tried. But on the other hand, there's a problem, and he wants to see it fixed. I appreciate that.
Dr. Burgess, we have probably 1 minute, so let me ask you a 1 minute question. It's an easy one.
Great.
When do you expect to see a replace bill?
Well, the moving parts of the replace bill were, in fact, it was the press conference that the speaker had here at AEI. I don't really remember what month it was. I think it was warm outside, but the Better Way agenda. And I don't think there's going to be any surprise. Now, all of the parts that are in the replace bill that come through the subcommittee, I think, are available to you in that Better Way agenda. There are probably too many ideas there. They probably all can't be incorporated in whatever happens in the next weeks and months. I will tell you this just from my perspective, and not as the chairman of the subcommittee, member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, or even a member of the Republican Conference. I favor smaller bills over bigger bills. So the fact that we have a list of things that can be used to fix the problems in the marketplace and delivery of health care, I think that's good. Let us evaluate those. Let us perhaps rank in order and start with the most important and work our way down and get as much done in the time frame that is allotted to us. But I think the last, when I did my town halls after the Affordable Care Act was unveiled and people were frightened of this 2,700-page bill that they saw in front of them, I don't think I had anyone on the right or the left say we'd really rather see a 2,700-page Republican bill. That was never part of the equation. They either didn't want the interference or there were things they wanted fixed that weren't being fixed. Again, we're on a rescue mission. I'd say let's fix the things that we can fix.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and please, everyone, join me in thanking Dr. Burgess. Thank you. That was really.